Thank you, everyone. My name is Deborah Dudak. I'm the Adult and Teen Services Manager here at the Fountaindale Public Library in Bolingbrook. Thank you so much for showing up and being in attendance for our second program of the day, Death Demystified, digging deeper into coroner and funeral home records with my friend Tina Beaird. So we're going to have some questions, and please leave your questions for the end of the session. We'll probably start taking questions about the last 10 minutes of the program today before we take a break at 12:30. So if you have any questions, please send those in online or hold those to the end of the session. So apart from that, please give Tina Beaird a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you to Deborah, my bestie. So I'm in my space. You guys know that I have a tendency to wander when I talk, so they have warned me that I need to try to stay on screen, right? And Deb also warned me that I must stay to an hour. So you guys know how I am. You've all heard me speak. An hour? I only get an hour? Okay, I will do my best. So as I get close to my time and Deborah starts tapping her foot, letting me know that my time's almost up, if I ramp up and put it into high gear and talk even faster than I already do, I apologize. But there's only two things I'm talking to you about. So I'm only talking to you specifically about coroner's records and funeral home records. Now you already heard Kimberly talk earlier about a little bit. She touched on them a tad. But there's a lot more that you can get out of these. There's a lot deeper that you can dig, pardon the pun, dealing with these particular types of death records. So believe it or not, I love this. So I'm searching on Amazon, because who also, like me, searches for books about death and dismemberment on Amazon, right? And there's a novel that's actually called Who Invited the Undertaker? I'm dying to read it. There you go. So there are many different terms that we've heard, over the decades when they refer to people who are doing the undertaking, handling the burial of the dead. So undertaker is probably the oldest term that you're going to hear. It's a term that is still used predominantly in the UK. So if you're searching for information on your British or your Irish ancestors, they're still using that term undertaker. There's still the Undertakers Association of the United Kingdom. So while we've progressed, so to speak, moved into morticians, moved into funeral directors, when you're dealing with UK records, you're still going to see this undertaker's term predominantly used even in the 21st century. So their job was to undertake the task of readying and preparing the body for burial. Now, typically that was done in the home. They would come to the house, they would wash the body, they would prepare it, to be buried the following day. Burial usually took place within 24 hours. It's not until we get into the time of the Civil War that you start to see, such a huge increase in the numbers dead and dying, not just from the war, but also from things like smallpox. Variola is the term that you'll see on those death certificates. We talked about smallpox, but when you see variola, that's what that is, it's smallpox. There was a huge number of people who were dying of the disease. In Plainfield alone, in Plainfield Township, 222 people died in a community of less than 700 of smallpox during the Civil War. So the largest battle with the most number of dead is the Battle of Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing. Right? That's when you really start to see this process of undertaking, the idea of readying the body for burial to be shipped back. Bodies went back home. A lot of Civil War soldiers who died were shipped back and sent home, back to their families. But it had to be done quickly, because what has a tendency to happen after about 3 days? It's not a pleasant experience, right? You don't want to be on that train with that wooden box. So they began embalming bodies to prepare them to last long enough to get them back to the north from places like Tennessee and Georgia. So does anybody know, it says right here, that they used to use arsenic. That's what the chemical was before formaldehyde, which is what they used in the 20th century going forward, but they used to use arsenic. So if any, and my people who attend my class when I talk about cemeteries have heard me say this before. If you go to an old cemetery, Civil War era cemetery, right, and they have those old hand-cranked pumps for you to water the flowers, don't ever wash your hands or drink, heaven forbid, drink the water that comes from those cemetery wells, because those bodies were being treated with arsenic, and that arsenic goes into the soil and goes into the water table. So if it's a city where they're bringing in water and it's coming from, it's city water and there's, a tower, but if it's an old hand-cranked pump, it's most likely well water. Don't drink the water, okay? And the reason being is because of the chemicals that they were using. So When we move into the 1920s, probably some of you have very good real examples of the dastardly deeds that morticians were doing in the 1920s. So with industrialization, with the end of the First World War, there was a huge increase in morticians in that time period because there was money to be made. There was industrialization, there was innovation, right? The folding chairs that we sit on when we go to events, you know what those were originally called? Undertaker's chairs, funeral chairs. There was a man in Ohio who invented the folding chair so it could be used for funerals. So that was all done, leading up into the 1920s. So the automobile, the hearse, right? That's where, that malfeasance started to come in. Well, you want to have a really nice casket. You want to have the best hearse. You want to have the best plot to take your family into the afterlife, right? Into the, to heaven. And there were lots of scandals, and there were lots of lawsuits, and there were lots of legal issues that came out in the 1920s from the mortician industry. Even in my own community, I live in Oswego, there was a funeral home in Montgomery, Illinois, that had convinced a church that where their family was buried, up on a ridge, that all of those bodies were now underwater, and they needed to move them to the brand new Riverside Cemetery that they were selling lots for. You need to move your family because they're not safe here. They were at the top of the ridge. So they moved them right next to the river. What happened? The river flooded often and still does flood. So, there was just a lot of malfeasance involved. So, when you read about, the burial industry in the 1920s, you're going to come across a lot of that. So just keep that in mind when you're looking. If you have family members you can't explain, all of a sudden their body was picked up and moved from one cemetery to another, is it in this time frame? Did they fall victim to, a spurious claim from a funeral director? That's when they barred them from being responsible for selling burial plots, right? So that you couldn't, double dip, so to speak, and make money by selling them your lots at a markup. So you see a lot of changes to regulation come in that time. But there are lots of information that can come out of funeral home records as well. There's two kind of categories to this. So when you're dealing with historic records, right, there's going to be different information collected than what's kind of required and mandatory now in the late 20th and 21st century. So early records were only interested in the burial process. They didn't collect genealogical data. But just like then as now, these are private businesses. It's a private industry. There is absolutely no obligation for them to turn over their records. So if a family funeral home closes, they're not obligated to give those records to the city. They're not obligated to turn them over to a historical society or to the county. They're their own private business. They could do with them what they like. And even if a cemetery or even if a funeral home sells out to a larger company, they're not required to give those records to the new business that's coming in either. So that's why it can get really hard to figure out exactly where funeral home records live, because if they're not still available, if they're not still in business, tracking down what might have happened to those can become pretty hard to do. So just keep that in mind. I'll tell you a little story. I know we're being filmed, so sorry, funeral homes out there who may be watching. But I've gone to a couple of funeral homes. One is a very large funeral home business, and I won't name names, but many of you know who I'm talking about. You walk in the door, and I'm looking for a funeral home record for my great-grandfather, blah, blah, blah. Oh, we can't give you those. It's a violation of HIPAA. We heard a little bit about HIPAA earlier, right? When does HIPAA stop? When they die. At death! So technically, they really can't use HIPAA as an argument against giving you funeral home records because it no longer applies to once they die and they leave the house, the hospital, wherever it happens to be, and they're the property, so to speak, of the funeral home, that's no longer HIPAA. That's no longer covered by HIPAA. So my argument to that is, okay, that's great. I'm going to go out to my car and get a FOIA request, and I'll be right back. Well, FOIA doesn't apply either because they're a private industry. But if they don't know that HIPAA doesn't apply, then they have no idea that FOIA doesn't apply either. So I raise you one, my counter offer. So again, they're private industry. They don't have to. They don't have to provide it to you. So the best we could do is be polite, be courteous, be kind, be generous, offer to pay them for the photocopies, right? But they don't have to give them to us. So now, when is the best time to go to a funeral home and ask for records? What time of year, right? What's their busiest time of year? winter, right? More people die in February than any other time of the year. Don't die in February, right? Or don't ask for records in February. March, you know, January, February, March, people make it through the holidays, right? It's the darkest, coldest time of year, right? More burials take place in February than any other time of the year. And then in late summer, July, August, September, heat waves, accidents, right? You know, car accidents. They're busy then too. So the best time to go and ask for these records would be, you know, late April to May, right? Or, you know, mid-October, you know, late September, early October, right? Because that's when it's a little bit quiet, right? If you send them a request in February asking for information on somebody who died 75 years ago, they're probably very interested in helping you, but there's just no way that they're going to have the time to get to it. And then it's very easy to forget, you know, so contact them at times off-peak seasons, so to speak. You know, this time of year would be the perfect time to send those requests to those funeral homes asking for information. You know, it's not always the case for cemeteries. Cemeteries are usually busier in the summer, right? Because they've got to maintain all the lawns. They've got to trim around the stones. So they're usually busier than funeral homes are at the time. But all morticians and funeral directors have to be licensed. And every state is responsible for doing their own licensing, right? So in the state of Illinois, it's done through the department, and I just forgot the name of it. You got the link, you can look it up, right? Professional regulation, the Department of Federal Regulation, professional regulation is who's responsible for that. So if you happen to have people in your ancestry who happen to have been undertakers, morticians, funeral directors, right, you can contact the state to get a copy of their application. And those vary over time. So the really early ones, before 1936, they have them at the State Archives in Springfield, and they're just ledger books with the name, the number, their certificate number, and the date. There's no application involved. But once you get into the 1930s going forward, then they have the application. Where did they go to school to become a mortician or an undertaker? You know, did they pass their licensing exam? How many times did it take them to pass their licensing exam? All of those are on those applications. So if you have family members who might have been morticians, then you can contact the state to get a copy of that information. But what are they responsible for recording? They're responsible for the date of death, cause of death, place of burial, who's paying for the grave? You know, who's paying for the funeral? Who's paying the costs associated with the burial process, right? So historically, this is what you're going to find. You're not going to find parents' names, maybe unless it's a child. You're not going to find date of birth or place of birth because that wasn't their job. In really early records, all they were interested in was the process of burying the body. They didn't care where you came from. What they were concerned with was, are you contagious? And that plays a difference, and I'll talk about that in a little while. As I digress shortly, before I talk about the rest of the types of records funeral homes have. On Illinois death certificates as an example, right, it gives me the name of the undertaker, so this is Wunderlich out of Joliet, and gives me the license number. Not every death certificate is going to have this information, so really early ones won't, and more modern ones won't. But, you know, for about 20 years, you know, there's a span in there where it gives you the license number. So if you're somebody who had undertakers in your family, morticians in your family, you know, luckily we're blessed with a lot of online databases that have copies of original certificates. You could just start slogging through them until you find your person listed on it, and then you've got that number right there to then contact the state for a copy of the record. So what else does funeral home records contain? So they're going to have the funeral expenses, you know, how much it cost to be embalmed or cremated. What was the cost of the casket? What was the cost of the hearse, the livery service, whether it was by train, whether it was by wagon, whether it was by car, out to the cemetery and back. You know, did they have flowers? Did they have singers? Did they have, you know, what was the cost for the grave digging? So a lot of times you can find those on those really early records, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples of those as well. Like I said, though, they don't always have that name, and I have a lot of people who say, but I'm looking for the names of the parents. Funeral home records aren't necessarily the place where you're going to want to go for that until you get into the mid to late 20th century. Here's a couple of examples. These are online through Family Search. It's one of their databases that's already in every name index, so you can go in and search for it. But what we can see from these records is, it gives me the name of the person, who paid for it, you know, the name of the next of kin who's paying for it, their cause of death, date of death, burial, place of burial. But what do you notice? There's no parents' names on that. There's no date of birth on that. They weren't interested in collecting that data. But what it offers you is it offers you a snapshot into the socioeconomic status in which your family lived. Could they afford to have singers? Could they afford to have 4 livery cars take people to the cemetery? Could they afford to have a fancy metal casket? Or could they only afford the bare necessities? And you see between these two records, while they're very similar, one paid a lot more money to have the bells and whistles, so to speak, at their service. 27-year-old man, right? 64-year-old man. So the dad is paying for the burial of his son. You know, the children are paying for the burial of their father. And you see the difference there, right? You know, that they have, you know, what did they ask for? Did they need gloves for the pallbearers? Did they have flowers? And it kind of gives you all of that information down here. So it just kind of provides you the economic status. So for people who die from disasters, you know, the Eastland disaster, the Iroquois Theater fire. Eastland disaster is a perfect example of this because a lot of those children who died had their burials paid for by, you know, either the Bohemian societies or the city or other entities. So they had very elaborate funerals with flowers and singers and multiple cars, livery, that took them out to Bohemian National Cemetery or out to some of the other cemeteries in the Chicagoland area, right, that were all paid for, and it would say, paid for by the city of Chicago, paid for by, you know, the Bohemian Society, right? And kind of gives you an idea of, you know, what were they paying for? You know, they wanted this to be a big event because it was such a tragic event, such a tragic undertaking. So, you know, it's interesting to see, could they only afford the cost of the box and that was it? Or, you know, did they take the time to really, you know, have an elaborate process? These are more modern records. You know, this one is from the 1940s. This is kind of what you will see. There's almost a standardized form now that you will see if you go to a funeral home and you have to go through this process yourselves, right? They give you what you would expect to see, similar to a death certificate. You know, it gives you the name of the person, their place of death, their date of death, who the doctor was, how they died. You know, this one's for a young child. This is for just under 2 years old, right? He fell into the river and drowned. But the reason why I include this record in here is because the body was shipped to Indiana for the actual burial process. So it tells me that the, ooh, goodness. Tells me that the little boy drowned in the DuPage River, right? His family, he was born in Muncie, right? His family was from Muncie and from Yorktown, right? That the funeral service was going to be held at this funeral home in Yorktown, Indiana. So basically all this funeral home did was prepare the body to get it ready to be shipped back home for the actual funeral to be held and for the burial process to occur. So you'll see this on different records where they might just be doing the processing and the actual service is being held somewhere else. Gives me the name of the clergy, gives me the name of the people who are taking care of it, and then where they're going, and then in case any of you are morbid like me and are curious what process they used in the embalming techniques, it tells you exactly how much chemical they used during the process. You know, but again, it gives me his date of birth, it gives me exactly how old they are, you know, tells me who his mother and father are. You won't see that on early records. They don't even bother to ask. Even for children, you don't always get that information. But you start to see it going forward from the 1930s once that licensing procedure starts to take place. But wills and probates are a great place to find some of this information out too. So if you're lucky enough to go through old wills or old probates, a lot of times included within the paperwork will be the receipt from the casket manufacturer, the headstone, the tombstone manufacturer, the funeral home, or the undertaker that takes care of the estate. So that tells me right there, if I can't find it any other way, and I'm lucky enough that they had filed a probate and there's paperwork associated in the county in which they died, a lot of times you can find this information and then go back and start looking for the funeral home records. Were they donated to a historical society? Did they go to a college, library, or university? Right? But it tells me exactly how much they paid, just like the funeral home book would give that same information. So it's just a copy of the receipt that was submitted to the estate to be paid. So that can be found a lot of times in those records as well. How many of you have family members who died and had to have a coroner's or a medical examiner's inquest? Right? So we're kind of blessed or cursed, depending on how you want to look at it in Illinois. Some records are better than others. So in Illinois, the coroner process is certified by the Illinois State Constitution. So when Illinois became a state in 1818, they included a law, a provision in there that every county would have a coroner's office in it. These records weren't mandatory to be required to be kept until 1869. But we're lucky enough that in some counties that these records date back further. Now, unfortunately in Illinois, even though statehood said that there had to be a coroner starting in 1818, the earliest records that exist are 1835. And what the coroner's job was to rule what the cause of death was. Their job is to focus on unnatural death, homicide, suicide, accident, right? You know, if it's somebody who's been sick for a long time and they know that they're dying of cancer, they're not going to go through the process of having a coroner's inquest because they already know. The doctor's already informed them that this is what's wrong with the person. But it's people who are dying unnaturally, seem to be in perfectly good health, die in their sleep, die in a car crash, a train accident, they drown, they commit suicide, they're murdered. Those are the kind of records that the coroner's office is in charge of seeing. And to give you an idea in the modern sense, the coroner's office is still in charge of handling all deaths that occur that are deemed unnatural, that they can't explain. But the coroners, we were talking a little bit earlier about autopsies, right? Autopsies aren't done on everybody who's brought into the coroner's office assuming that it's an unnatural death, right? They're very selective in the number they do, just simply because of staff time, equipment, and ability. You know, sometimes it's very obvious and they can give a ruling without having to do an autopsy. But a medical examiner is different from a coroner. Are you guys familiar with that? So a coroner is somebody who is elected on the ballot every 4 years. So the law in Illinois changed in the 1880s that said, no, we're not going to make this a 2-year term anymore. We're going to make it a 4-year term. So anybody, all of us, we can all decide we want to run for coroner, right? You don't have to be a doctor. You don't have to have any medical experience whatsoever. You just have to run as a party, pick a platform, and run for coroner's office, right? Even now, in the 21st century, you don't have to have a medical degree. You don't have to have any experience to become a coroner. That is very different from a medical examiner. So a medical examiner has to be a trained doctor. So the medical examiner preferred would be a forensic pathologist. So somebody who is an expert in diseases and causes of death. Somebody who is trained, you know, in forensics to look for the most minute details, right, to deem cause of death. Coroners don't need to have that. Coroners don't even have to hire that, which is disturbing. So NPR put out 2 great articles, right? So NPR has a listing on their website of, ooh, goodness, this thing is very touchy today. So I highly advise you to take a look at both of these articles because they're really interesting. So they did a year-long expose where they wrote articles about the death process in America in the 21st century. But the bottom link gives you a map that shows you which states are coroners, which states are medical examiners, which are a hybrid of the two. So we only have one medical examiner in the state of Illinois, and it's in Cook County. Everybody else is an elected coroner. The medical examiner is appointed, and they're appointed to that task from the county government. So the president of the Cook County Board appoints the medical examiner for Cook County. And that person is a licensed doctor and, in fact, a forensic pathologist. So those people who are dealing with a large number of deaths, cities like Boston, cities like Chicago, have medical examiners on staff, right? DuPage County, Will County, Kendall County, Perry County, they're all just appointed. So I'm being videotaped. So I have to think of how I'm going to say this in a politically correct manner. Sometimes you get what you pay for. Let's put it that way. So sometimes you have coroner's offices that have taken the time to get the training to do the rudimentary basics of pathology, right? So the state offers a program, I think it's 6 weeks, where you go and you learn about how to, you know, handle the process of an unnatural death. You know, how do you draw blood for toxicology reports? You know, how do you take crime scene photos to make sure that you're collecting all of the evidence? 6 weeks of training. And not every state requires this. And even in the state of Illinois, they're trying to make it mandatory. They don't have to. Right? So the coroner, the person who's elected, is typically not the person who's doing any of this. They have deputy coroners, right? And they have staff that go and get this training. A lot of them are EMTs. A lot of them have medical experience in some sense, but they're not doctors. They're not nurses. Right? So depending on where you live, you get what you pay for. Some states, and you'll read in these reports that just the ineptness of things that easily by any pathologist would have been able to declare homicide, right? Gets deemed a suicide and off you go. So I don't want to get into a whole expose about that, but there's a lot of mistakes made, even in Cook County, even in Boston. There was an article about Boston where they talked about how, the medical examiner's office is only funded about half of what they need. So they have to pick and choose. Which one seems more likely that it's going to be a homicide versus a suicide, and then investigate those, because they just don't have the staff nor the money to make sure that they're doing the most thorough job they can on every case. So only about a third of the cases, a fourth of the cases that come into the coroner's office actually have autopsies that are done, right, in the modern sense. And the process that had happened historically is still what happens now. So there would be an inquest that would be held. They would ask a series of questions. They would have jurors who would sit on a jury who would listen to the details and the facts of the case. And this goes back historically all the way to the 21st century, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in some states and in some cities, the coroner could actually file their own death certificate. And in some counties, there's even a temporary death certificate before a permanent death certificate is issued. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. So the doctor could rule, there could be a doctor's death certificate, cause of death, cancer, they had been sick for 6 months. And then if a coroner's inquest is held, there'll be a little checkbox where it says, was there an inquest held, yes or no? If it says yes, then you're going to go to the coroner's office to look for more detail. But then the coroner could also put out its own death certificate as well. So what they would look for are what was on the body, what physically was on the body, how much change was in their pocket, what were they wearing, who's their next of kin that they're going to contact, what is the cause of death, again, homicide, suicide, accident, drowning, train accident, fire, who are the jurors, and where are they from, which could be interesting. And they would usually do these quarterly. So in the local newspapers, a lot of times, they would run a list of who the jurors were for that quarter. And it would tell you who they were and where they were from. It's usually the wealthier guys in town because they could be off from the farm to sit in and listen to these cases. And then the verdict. We, the jury, in the coroner's inquest, find that the person came to their death by their own hand. And they'll give the verdict in there. Modern coroner's records are going to have more than that. You're still going to see those booklets where they're just giving the verdict, but then they're also going to have, the time and location of the incident, where were they found, how were they found, who was the first person on the scene, was it the fire department, was it the police, was it a doctor, was it a family member, who's the first person there, what do they feel is the cause of death, who's the next of kin, very similar to the other records, and then their reports, their autopsy with photos, be advised, toxicology tests. If they think it was a drug overdose, they're going to do toxicology reports. Don't watch NCIS and think that a toxicology report's going to come back in a day. It takes a month at least before you get those results back. And then any testimony. Did this person commit suicide by jumping off a bridge? Were they hit by a car walking across the street? Who was around to witness the accident and can give testimony? It would have where the body is going. Is it going straight to the cemetery? Is it going straight to be cremated? Is it going to a funeral home for a funeral? And then what the jury feels is its verdict. So when you're looking at historic records, you're not going to get that testimony a lot of times, not until the 20th century, later 20th century. But this process goes way back. Like I said, some states you're going to find them earlier than what we have, which is 1835. But in Illinois, the death process, deaths weren't recorded in Illinois until November 1st of 1877. And even then, it was requested, not required. It wasn't required until 1914. Right? So as Kim mentioned, if you're lucky enough that they died in the year of the census and you can catch them on a mortality index, great. But otherwise, you almost kind of hope, I know it's terrible to say, that they die of unnatural causes because there might be a coroner's record before 1877 that exists to tell you what happened. Right? So in Will County, they go back to 1869. In Kendall County, they go back to 1864. Just depends on where you live and how much detail is in them. Even in more modern records, they'll include newspaper articles about what happened. They'll snip them out of the paper and lay them into the verdict book so you can see what happened. And I've found many of those historically looking through the books, but there's still plenty of places that do that now, and I'll show you an example of that. Coroner's inquest juries are appointed by the circuit court. So even today, they pick a panel of jurors who are going to go and hear cases quarterly. They're going to hear the details of the case, and they're going to give their ruling. Most of these only take about 15 or 20 minutes. They'll hear all of them on one day. There might be 3 for a quarter. It depends on where you live. There might be 18 for a quarter. And they'll sit down, and just like if you go to a county board meeting, they're on the dais, they're all sitting next to each other, they're talking about the case. They're open to the public, so you're allowed to go and watch and listen to what the verdicts are and how they're coming across, how they're reaching their verdict, right? And then they're just going to go over what they know, right? Sometimes the police officer will come and he'll talk about what he saw. He was the first person on the scene. You know, sometimes there's family members that they'll question and ask them, you know, was there a note? Was there anything behind? So, you know, so that's where that eyewitness testimony comes from family. If you're not next of kin, if you're not family, you can submit a FOIA request to get copies of Coroner's Inquest, modern Coroner's Inquest records. But keep in mind, so I asked my husband this morning, I said, can I tell this story? And he says, well, if you feel comfortable, go ahead and tell it. So my husband and I, our best friend killed himself 5 years ago, committed suicide. And my husband went, you know, to the inquest. He wanted to hear what the court was going to rule. So I asked him, I said, are you okay if I share the details of that? He's like, yeah, that's fine, it's all public record. But he was there along with the widow, and other families were there to hear the testimony for their loved one who was having a coroner's inquest. And it's the same process in 2017 as it was in 1917, right? They're sitting down, they're asking for witnesses, what did you see, what did you hear, what do you know? They've got the list of jurors, okay, what are the facts in the case, and they're hearing the facts of the case. So in my husband's case, you know, they had the autopsy report there. And they asked him, do you want to see the report? And he said, yes, I want to see the report. And they said, do you want to see the photos? And he said, yes, I want to see the photos. It's like, no. So I didn't go, I didn't see them, I couldn't. Because I couldn't bear the thought of taking a look at them. So be advised that if you're going to submit a FOIA request, there's the very real possibility that that's what's going to be included. So not to gross anybody out, not to bring anybody down, but you know, you might think that you're just going to get the verdict in the inquest, you know, the ruling. If you're submitting a FOIA, they're going to give you everything. So just be advised that sometimes you might not want to know everything. I mean, you can request for them to leave that information out. So when I go through Coroner's Inquest books, sometimes they're kind of cool. So, you know, sometimes they'll include photos. This poor guy had died because he got hit in the head. He was working for a train and something happened and something fell off the train and crushed his skull. You know, so you could see him laying there on the table before, you know, they're giving their inquest. You know, it's not terribly gruesome, but it's still kind of, right? Here's that Quincy, right? So we were joking earlier about dropsy, right? And Deb said, oh, it could be Quincy. And I said, wait, isn't Quincy that coroner guy on TV? Right, you remember the show, Quincy? I loved that show when I was a kid. What does that tell you? Right? But they'll include all of this information. You could see across the top, it gives the date, gives the name of the witnesses, gives their locations, where they're from, and then the next page would have the verdict. Some of these just break your heart. You know, and I'll tell this story in a second, because, you know, there'll be children who died in the childbirth process because the doctor makes a mistake, right? And that's in there because it's an unnatural cause of death. So this one, Christian Henney was murdered by a deranged bicyclist. So I'm not talking two-wheeled bicycle like Wizard of Oz. 1890, the big-wheeled bicycle, right? The really tall ones, right? So Christian Henney is on his way home. He's coming down Grove Road in Kendall County, and he's coming southbound, and northbound is this bicyclist. Great big wheel. Apparently, Christian Henney gets a little bit too close to the bicyclist and clips his wheel, and he falls off the bike and lands on the ground. Gets up, yells at him a little bit, and then continues on his way. Christian Henney doesn't think anything of it. Guy turns around and comes after him, follows him. They have an altercation, and the deranged bicyclist shoots him in the stomach. So we're talking farmland here, right? So he's got to ride in his wagon to get to the nearest farmstead, which is half a mile away. So he gets to the farmstead, he knocks on the door, he's doubled over, he's bleeding, right? He's slurring his words, asks for the husband. The wife says, well, he's not here, go away, and sends him away. So he gets back in his wagon and goes to the next farmhouse, another half mile away, gets up to the door, knocks on the door, says, can I speak to your husband? She's like, well, he's eating his supper, you're going to have to wait. Right? Because they think he's a drunk. He's doubled over. And he collapses on the porch, and she sees that he's covered in blood, and they go for the doctor. By the time the doctor gets back, he's dead. But while he's dying, he recounts this tale to the husband and wife at the farmhouse, right, about how he accidentally clipped this guy. He came back, he shot him. And so what are you guys doing to me? I got to tip this up. Stop that, Jeffrey. So in the verdict, all they can list are the details. What were his personal effects? Who was a witness? So the farmer and his wives and the other people. Who the jurors were who heard the case. Where are they from? Right? Their occupations. He came to his death by the gunshot wound in the abdomen by some party or parties unknown to the jury. They don't know who the guy was. So that's all the verdict can give you. But they didn't feel justified in just having that as their verdict, so they put the full-length column from the newspaper, the original, tucked up in the inquest page, where it recites everything that happened about how he has a young widow with young children, and she's, hysterical, and how's she going to feed her family. Like, the whole kit and caboodle is in this article, tucked into this coroner's inquest. So while they never found the guy, and while there was nobody to convict because there was nobody to catch, right, at least the coroner took the time to keep that article out of the newspaper a couple days later and put it in as evidence, as testimony to the actual case. So it's a fascinating story. So don't cut off any bicyclists, right? But as you start to move into the 20th century, you do start to get testimony that is available to you. So this one is from 1920. This is for the young man Edward Trent. This is DuPage County. So what happened to Eddie Trent was he worked for the E.J. Railroad. They went to the Normantown Railroad station at Frontenac, or went to the Frontenac station, I should say, in Naperville. And the kids went into the house to get warm. It's the middle of winter. So the kids went down into the basement by the furnace to warm up, and Eddie had backed up and got too close to the flywheel of the furnace, and the flywheel caught his shirt and just smashed him, just crushed him. So in the testimony, and it's like a 3-page testimony, are the people talking about how they ran out of the house, out of the building to go find Eddie's dad, because he was with them. He had gone into the station master's house to check in, and about how he carried his lifeless body up the stairs and laid it down for the police to come and blah, blah, blah. But it gives the testimony all right there. So once you get into the 20th century, you start to get a little bit more of this testimony available to you. And it'll give you the names of the people who were present, and then the verdict, which, what did he have on his body at the time, who was part of the jury, and you see that from there. These ones are a little bit harder to read because it's so small, but it's the jury finds, I got to tip it up so I can read it myself. That the cause of death came about 1 o'clock on September 9th, 1903, that this is, it was a suicide, that no foul play was found. The person hangs themselves, they're doing this. This is the one about the little baby. We find that he came to his death from an umbilical cord that was wrapped around his neck. That was the responsibility of the attending physician. And then this one, this is a case where the attending physician had way too much confidence in his ability to ligate a vessel. So they threw the doctor under the bus on that one, like, it's all your fault, buddy. He died because of you. So, they'll be very specific as they can on what they think the actual cause of death is. These are available online even up into the 21st century. So depending on where you live in the country, Family Search, Ancestry, some of these places have these available. This one comes from Family Search, but it's a case from the 2000s, I think, 2000. And again, even in the 21st century, they're still including the newspaper clippings from what was going on. Clipping that out of the newspaper and including it in the coroner's inquest file. But the same types of things you're going to see. Who was the first person to respond? What was the time of the incident? What was the estimated cause of death? And they would ask witnesses. So these are usually 2 or 3 pages. There's one page that's redacted, that's blacked out because it's still considered a modern record. So if you were to contact them with a FOIA request or as next of kin, you'd be able to get the full file. But online, they're just giving you the verdict. That's what we're seeing here. But they're still available. You can still find them. So we were talking a little bit about Family Search a little while ago, and Deb was talking about affiliate libraries, right? And the ability that affiliate libraries have to get into Family Search. And I want to take 2 minutes to talk about that. So our library, Plainfield Library, is an affiliate library. Deb will be an affiliate library. Wheaton is, Arlington Heights is, Batavia is. There's a lot of libraries that have access to records through Family Search. So historically, an affiliate library was able to request microfilm. Well, when they decided to eliminate microfilm requests, they gave those libraries who had that status already the ability to look at the digital images. So if a microfilm had been done, then we're allowed to look at the digital images in our library. So even though we can't request them anymore, we still have access to them. So what that means is I no longer have to drive to Lake County, Illinois to look at Lake County death certificates. I can just log in from my computer at the library and take a look. I don't have to go to Scotland, sadly, anymore to look at records. I can just pull them up on my computer. So how this benefits us is it's a game changer. How many of you have played with the records now that they're accessible online from one of our affiliate libraries, right? So why this is important to us, especially when we're talking about death records, funeral home records, coroner's inquest records, is that I don't have to go to Cook County to look at the coroner's inquest records anymore. I can log into Family Search and look at those Cook County coroner's inquest records up to 1911. Whereas before I would have to go to one of the IRAD libraries and look at the microfilm myself. I don't have to do that now. So the caveat is you have to go to a library that's an affiliate. But as an affiliate library, it's all recognized by IP address. So you could come in with your own laptop. You can come in and sit in the parking lot. You can sit at a picnic table outside of the building as long as you can connect to our Wi-Fi. And you'll have access to these same records that I have access to in the building. So things like Stark County, things like Washington State and Cook County are all available to you now as long as they've been microfilmed and digitized by the Family Search Library. So, you don't have to try to figure it out anymore and figure out who might have the records. I wouldn't always necessarily start with Family Search, but now I do. For certain types of records, funeral home records, I'm going to start with Family Search and see if those are already digitized. And they have huge collections, which you have at the end. I'll point some of them out for you. But it's a great way to find some of these more modern, mid-century records that aren't always available. I can't go to Ohio, I can't go to Washington State, but yet they're already digitized and I can find them through Family Search. So just wanted to take a couple minutes to explain how that could really benefit us by using an affiliate library to get access to these collections. So now Cook County, like I said, is the only medical examiner in the entire state of Illinois. And they switched in 1976. So they passed a law in 1972, and it took them 4 years to switch over from the coroner till his term was up to then appoint a medical examiner. So when you look at really early Cook County records, they're still going to say coroner of Cook County because they did not switch until 1976. But what they do is they have their own sets of death certificates that they issue from the coroner's office. And they're not alone. There's a lot of counties that do that themselves. So these two that we're looking at right here, it's the same coroner, it's Traeger in Cook County, and they're both from the Iroquois Theater Fire. Right? You had over 800 people die. Just like when you're dealing with the Eastland, you had over 800 people who died. So if it's a singularity event, one person, it's a car versus train, and that person dies, you'll usually get a lot more detail to a coroner's inquest than you get when it's a mass event. And the reason being is they have to write the same thing for 800 people, right? Or 50 people, whatever the case may be. Like I have the coroner's inquest from the Plainfield tornado in 1990, right? And those 28 coroners all start the same way. Came to their death because of a tornado that struck, August 28th, 1990. And there's not always a lot of detail there. So on the earlier ones that they did, right, 200 later, it's all typed up. He must have got sick and tired of having to hand write all these, but they give you what happened. The fire caught, the building caught fire, people tried to escape, they died of smoke inhalation, or they were trampled to death, or in a couple of cases, the women jumped to their deaths from the balcony thinking if they landed on the stage, they'd have a better chance, right? And it kind of gives you the detail of what the case is. So in something like that, you've got Clara Devine here, 3 people in her family died, but their coroner's inquests aren't, sequential. So you have to kind of look, you have to go through them and look to make sure you're not missing a family member because they didn't do them all together at one time. Does that make sense? So you want to look. And then like for this one, for Mary Fahey, they finally started typing them up, and it gives you, it's easier to read, but it gives you a little detail about what happened during the event. So keep in mind when you're dealing with mass events, you're not always going to get the level of detail that you want out of the coroner's inquest, and you're better off turning to other sources like newspapers, biographies or books that were written about the event, and then litigation. A lot of people sued. Iroquois Theater Fire is a perfect example of how it changed fire codes across the entire country, not just in Cook County, right? So there's legal, there's lawsuits, there's congressional hearings. So there's a lot of stuff that comes out of that. So if you have a coroner's inquest for somebody who died from an event like that, then you should start looking for lawsuits, you know, hearings and things like that that'll give you some more information about the event. Here's another example. Can you read it? I swear I'm not making this up. This person's name is Pearly Gates. And I thought there was no better record to include on a topic about death than somebody whose name was actually Pearly Gates. So this was a man, Pearly Gates, right? So he died in Cook County, right? He had a hemorrhage of the lungs, right? He died. But Pearly Gates shows up in both the Cook County Death Index from Cyberdrive, Illinois, as well as the coroner's inquest records for Cook County. So I didn't make him up. He's a real person. He shows up in both of these indexes with the death certificate number, you know, with the certificate that's provided here. But this certificate came from the coroner's office because they had to figure out why Pearly died so unexpectedly, right? So the coroner's office would put out their own. So here's the, I'm really twisted, right? So most of us as genealogists probably are, right? So I really geeked out when I found the site on Cook County's coroner, the medical examiner's website, that has like a breakdown of what everybody dies of, right? Kind of by year and where. And there's a map. They've got a heat map. So you can see, you know, how many people died of car accidents, how many people died of drug overdoses, how many people died of gunshots, right? So this is the link. It was fascinating. So go in and look at this. It's a little disturbing, and I realize I'm a bit creepy, but this was really kind of cool to go in and look at, right? So I grew up in Bridgeport. I grew up on the south side, and I'm looking at the heat map of Bridgeport, and I'm like, nobody dies in Bridgeport? Like the 6 people who died in Bridgeport all died of accidents, and I'm like, what kind of accidents? Right? It doesn't tell me, but it's a really interesting map to take a look at. But like I said, Cook County issues a temporary as well as a permanent death certificate. And across the top, like these are before medical examiner. So it says that it's a temporary record, that no coroner's fees are collected, right? It gives me inquest pending. They don't know what the cause of death is yet. They haven't investigated it. But it tells me who they are, when they're born, you know, how old they are, who their next of kin is, who the attending doctor was, where they're buried. But what's missing is the cause of death. So if you look at the date on here, has social security number on there too, but you don't necessarily need that. But if you look at the date of when this one is filed, June 5th, and then June 7th, they file the permanent certificate, right? So it's worth it to keep in mind. Go back through your records that you might have and make sure that you have the permanent certificate. Make sure it doesn't say temporary across the top of it, because if so, then you're going to want to go and look for what the official cause of death was. You know, so this one is he committed suicide. You know, he died of arsenic poisoning. That was self-ingested, right? But if you only had this one, you don't necessarily have that information. So you want to make sure that you're checking that you don't have the temporary, that you've got the permanent certificate. Now, what about burial transfers? Have any of you had anybody whose body was transferred for burial? This can be a hot mess. And the reason being is because the person who was responsible at the end, right, whether it's the cemetery, whether it's the funeral director or a mortician, it's their job to then take these and file these with the county. Do they always do that? No. So a lot of times you're missing records because the person never finished the final process. These ones are both from 1890, just as an example. Excuse me. So this one, they died in San Antonio. Their body was shipped back to Joliet for burial November 12, 1890. There's nothing genealogical about this at all. They're not giving you date of birth. They're not giving you next of kin or who their parents are. But what's important about this is if you die out of state and your body is shipped back for burial, just like we saw with the little baby who drowned, body was sent back to Indiana for burial. What has to happen in that process is an official death certificate from the county in which the death occurred needs to accompany a copy of the transfer permit with the body to the person who is accepting it, funeral director, cemetery, whomever is taking responsibility for the body. They're going to do their job. You know, so in Indiana, we would find another funeral home record for that little boy that shows, did they have a service? Did they have gloves? Who carried the casket? Who is the pallbearers? There would be another sheet there. And then their job would be to take it to that county in Indiana and then file it. And in that county, you should see both things. The original death certificate from here, wherever the death occurred, as well as a copy of the transfer permit. It doesn't always happen. And it doesn't always happen or get filed in a logical manner. So in Will County, which many of you have heard me nag about before because they couldn't find, with a flashlight. We're just going to leave it there with a flashlight. They have no idea what they're doing. In some years, the county clerk's office recorded them with the death certificates as they came in. But in some years, they thought they'd be clever and they would put all the burial transfer permits at the beginning of the quarter. So you have to look through them to see if you could figure it out. So January, May, July, October, did I do that math right? You might have 10, 15, 20 burial permits if they did them quarterly. Or they might be interfiled, depending on when your body came back and it was filed with the county. So sometimes you have to look through these. So if you're going online, if you're looking at indexes, whatever the county, whatever the state, don't just go to February if you think that's when their body was moved. Sometimes you have to look at the beginning of each quarter to see if that's how it was registered. So, I'm hurrying. See, I told you. So sometimes they'll give you that. So if I die in Pueblo, Colorado, my body's brought back to Kendall County, there's supposed to be that paperwork that accompanies it. The only time they could not do that was if you were contagious. If you were contagious, your body was buried where you died. So if there was the chance of infectious disease, if you died in Florida, you stayed in Florida. If you died in California, you stayed in California. So if you have people that you can't figure out why on earth they're buried in Kansas City, it's very possible because they died of an infectious disease, and they are not legally allowed to transfer your body. So keep that in mind if you're wondering why people die in weird places. City directories, again, are a great resource for this information, simply because they're going to have everybody involved with the death process, from the church to the coroner to the cemetery to the casket manufacturer to the funeral home. You have to be looking at city directories pertinent to the time period you're looking for. Because if you're looking in Plainfield, Illinois for modern day funeral homes, right? That's not going to do you any good if you're looking for somebody who died in 1912. So you have to make sure that you're looking through city directories, phone directories, county gazetteers pertinent to the time period, so you know that you're looking for the right funeral home, the right cemetery, or the right church. So now I got an example for you. Can I give my example?
Sure.
You're looking at me.
Then there's no question.
She's giving me the side eye. So Thomas Brown is my example, and the reason being is because I know the Brown family. Thomas Brown died in a pedestrian car accident. He stepped out between two cars, got hit by another car, and was killed. So the death occurred in Aurora, and actually he was taken to St. Charles where he was pronounced dead. So they interviewed his sister the day of the accident at the Healy Chapel in Aurora, right? Ooh. Took the testimony, right? I'm his sister, what was his occupation, what's your occupation, blah, 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 blah. 3 pages later, they give their verdict. He was hit by a car, died of injuries sustained. But they interviewed her at the funeral chapel in Aurora. But that's not where his body was laid. His body was laid at Luce Funeral Home in Plainfield, two counties away, right? So it tells me at the bottom, that he died, he was taken to St. Charles, he was hit by a car, his body was brought back here for the service and to be buried in Wheatland Township, right? The name of his mother, name of his father, blah, blah, blah. But 2 completely different counties. So you have to be aware that, like we saw with the little boy, just because you died in that county doesn't mean that that's where they're going to be doing your service. So Healy Chapel has records, and Luce Funeral Home has records. Healy Chapel is still around. And then, because in Plainfield, we always have to take things up a bar, the funeral home director's wife kept a daily journal. And in that daily journal, she kept track of everything, like when she harvested her tomatoes and who came to visit on Sunday morning. Well, in her diary, along with other weird, everyday, natural things, she talks about her husband having to go to Aurora to pick up the body of Tom Brown. And then the following day, his funeral was held, and the attendance was much larger than anticipated because it was a warm day. So sometimes you're lucky enough to find the obscure, and this happens to be at the Plainfield Historical Society, but gives us the details of the process of picking up the body and bringing it back for burial. So you guys have in your handouts already, you already have a list. What'd she just tell me? I've got 6 minutes, right? I have until 12:30. How much she's rushing me? I got 6 minutes.
Lots of questions.
Oh, you don't have questions for me? You'll meet me at lunch and we'll talk about it. So I told you it'd be hard to keep it to 60 minutes. I'm going to make it. So in Illinois, where can we look? So Cook County has their coroner indexes available online up to 1911. Those are available through CyberDrive Illinois. You have the link there. Elgin has some of their funeral home records online. They're pretty cool. You can go and take a look if you have family from Elgin. Other counties in Illinois do have coroner's indexes available. That gets you the link into the 5 other counties in Illinois that have them available. But then things like state memory projects, Illinois Digital Archives, right, IDA, Illinois, Alabama, California Archive, Florida Memory Project, all of these, and this is just a sampling of the state memory projects that either have coroner's records, funeral home records, cemetery records available online. And some really good ones too. Florida has a huge collection of funeral home records available online. South Carolina, apparently the South Carolina Mortuary Union, for lack of a better word, put out a quarterly newsletter for like 60 years. So you want to know all about the death process in South Carolina, they've got a newsletter that you can download. I mean, just some really cool stuff is available. We have a tendency to go to national websites to look for things. Family Search, Ancestry, Find My Past, right? Every one of our states has their own state memory project, state digital archives. Take advantage of what the state has, because there's a lot of that funeral home stuff available already through our own individual states. Ancestry does have some collections. What's interesting with national companies is there's a lot of overlap. So Ancestry has the California mortuary records. They've got the records for San Francisco. But so does Find My Past. And so does Family Search. There's a lot of overlap there. So you can get to it from multiple places. This is just a snapshot of some of the things that they have. Again, Family Search. These are the databases that are already done, every name you can go into. But again, that affiliate status, going into that card catalog is going to open up thousands more records to you than just the ones that they've already gone through the process. When you go into the card catalog across the top, right, it'll say search. It's a drop-down menu. It says books, wiki, catalog. If you click on catalog, right, you could do a search on whatever you want. I did a search on mortuary, right? How many ways can you say this? Undertaker, funeral director, mortuary, crematorium, right? All the different ways you can say this. You have to search that way. And they give you this little link. Do you just want to see what's online, or do you just want to see everything? We want to see everything to see if they even exist. Then you can narrow it down to online. But you want to keep track. And these are all the decades you could look through. So in Family Search, I can go and I can see the records specifically for Carolyn Sperry, right? Carolyn Sperry is referenced in all those other indexes for San Francisco. Find My Past, Ancestry. But if I want to look at the original, I'm going to go to Family Search to pull it up. And it's easy to do. Find My Past gives me her name, tells me she's widowed, gives me the certificate number and where I can find the record. So then I can go right into Family Search and boom, there's the original. I can cross-reference the two very easily. Have any of you used Archive Grid? Did you know you could use Archive Grid for funeral home records? Yes, Deb? So Archive Grid, if you have never used it before, it's set up from, it takes archives from universities, colleges, museums, historical societies that have uploaded their records into the WorldCat system, which is used for libraries. So the World Catalog is available for libraries, but there's also a separate one for archives. But I can go in and see all of those small record collections that have been donated to Joliet Junior College, Logan College, Monmouth College, right? And see what types of records. This is a great place to find those funeral homes that closed, that you want to see if they donated their records. This is a great place to go. So up here across the top, in a list view, it gives me a nice column. But if I go to a summary view, that's where I have the ability to sort by state, by city, by time period. You just choose the collection. So if you go into summary view, that's where you can narrow it down to just Illinois. That's where you can narrow it down to just Arkansas to see those records. But look, right? You don't know what term they're going to use to describe their business. So you need to think in all the different ways that you could say funeral home, right? Undertaker, crematorium, funeral directors are different than funeral homes. So when you're doing your search, whether it's in Family Search, whether it's an ancestry, whether it's an archive grid, you have to be using as many subject terms as you possibly can to get into those records. You guys have the rest of these lists of websites. Cindy's list, Digital Public Library, another great resource to find funeral home records. Postcards of funeral homes, a lot of those are in there. Internet Archive again. And then, I'm moving out of camera. Is Jeremy back there to yell at me? The Red Book National Directory, which is a listing of all the funeral homes that exist currently in the United States. They've been publishing this every year since 1936. The original year is at the Allen County Public Library. I've not found it digitized online yet. But again, if you're looking for people between 1936 and 2018, these are a great resource to find that year you're looking for, to find out what homes were around. This one is an Internet Archive. So they actually have funeral home records digitized in Internet Archives. This one's from the DAR. And then book resources. So today, Deb and I will be giving away prizes to all of you at the end. And Caitlin Doherty's book and Mary Roach's books were my donation. So whoever the lucky winner is, you get to read about death and dying. So don't you all want to? So I will stick around at lunch. Ask me questions at lunchtime, because I don't eat, and thanks for coming. 1 minute. 1